Welcome to Bluebook, Digital SAT Test 1, Module 1. My name is Vince. Let's get straight into it. Obviously, we're talking about reading and writing here, guys. So, first one, word in context. Researchers and conservationists stress that biodiversity loss due to invasive species is blank, so we have no idea what to do yet. And then we have a for example. So we can kind of see that the next sentence here is illustrating the first sentence. In other words, they have a support relationship. So we can kind of just see what happens in the second one, and the same thing should be talked about in the first sentence. For example, people can take simple steps such as washing their footwear after travel to avoid introducing bad organisms. Okay, so that would mean it's preventable. So just logically think about, hey, do the sentences support each other or do they contrast? It's going to be one of the two. If they support, like we have here, just kind of say the same thing in the first or make them connect as logically as you can. All right, number 2. It is by no means blank to recognize the influence of Dutch painter Hieronymus Bosch on, I'll just say, A.B.'s paintings. Indeed, B himself cites Bosch as an inspiration. And I'm always a little suspicious. I think I can get it at this point, but I'm going to read the last sentence as well because the main idea of the passage honestly helps me. However, some scholars have suggested that the ancient Mesopotamian poem, Epic of Gilgamesh, may have had a far greater impact on Bannister's work. So it's kind of helpful to me here to kind of consider all the context. I mean, I would think that it's just a support relationship here because of the indeed and because of the semicolon. Those Either one of those things is going to indicate support. But we do have a contrast, and what I also want to think about here is that the entire first part of the passage and everything after the however are going to contrast with each other. And the way that I can do that is I can pick C. And let me explain that logic to you because this is a harder question. It's by no means unimportant to recognize the influence of Bosch. And, Bondicelli himself says Bosch was an inspiration. But, however, some people think the ancient poem was a bigger influence. So we have a contrast in the way that it works is like, okay, Bosch was a big influence. However, the ancient poem was even bigger. So picking unimportant creates that contrast because it's no means unimportant. However, it's actually even more important to recognize the ancient poem. So we have that style of contrast. We kind of go from big influence to even bigger influence. Okay, number 3, the function. I always look at the question first in reading and writing, and I'm trying to get the function of the second sentence. I'm going to read the whole passage, and then I'm going to go back and kind of think about what is the second sentence's job. And it may just deal with the first sentence, but it may be kind of connected to both, or we may have to think about each sentence here. And when I'm reading, I'm getting the gist. I'm not trying to memorize it. Obviously, I don't care if I don't understand a little detail. I'm just trying to say, okay, what is the purpose of each sentence? And let me explain what I mean by that after I read it. So astronomers are confident that the star Betelgeuse will eventually consume all of the helium in its core and explode in a supernova. So we just read that. But what I would say in terms of taking some notes here is I would say that sentence 1 is kind of the theory. Whoa, my font size a little on the small side here. Let's try that again. Theory. Sentence 1 is a theory. If I can spell theory. Sentence 2, what is it? They are much less confident, however, about when this will happen, since that depends on stuff that they don't know. And this is kind of like a problem. Now, what is the third sentence's job? Astrophysicist Serafina and her colleagues recently investigated whether something or other could be used to determine this thing. And notice I'm kind of like saying something or other because I don't really care what it is. I'm just mostly looking for what happened in layman's terms here and basic terms. But they concluded the method couldn't really do anything. So I'm going to just say they failed. They failed. All right. So the job, we kind of already have predicted the answer here when we do this kind of strategy because, hey, we know the job of each sentence. Job of sentence 1, present a theory. Job of sentence 2, present a problem. Job of sentence 3, kind of explain that whatever they tried didn't work to fix the problem. Now, if we think about sentence two, which is what the question wants, it's exactly what we predicted. It's the problem they tried to solve. Beautiful. It's a beautiful thing when strategies, well, it makes sense to me. Hopefully it makes sense to you. All right, we got another function one. Function of the third sentence. Let's do the same thing that we just did. All right, what's the first sentence say? The mimosa tree evolved in East Asia where the beetle BT preys on its seeds. So this is, and one of the reasons I'm writing this stuff down, you don't have to do this when you're taking a test, but I want you guys to be able to classify what sentences do. In other words, not what it says, but what it is, what its job is. And the first sentence is kind of a fact. And writers almost always begin with background information, so you know what we're talking about. Because did you know what a mimosa tree was? I didn't know. Do you know what that beetle is? Nope, me neither. What does the next sentence do? And the job of the next sentence is always going to be connected to what we've already said, or the job of any sentence is connected to what we've already said. So we're still talking about the mimosa trees, not surprisingly. They were introduced. So this is kind of like another fact. They were brought to North America. And then the third sentence is kind of like, it's sort of just kind of like a fact. I'm just going to call it a fact again, even though that might not seem that helpful. I got to call it something. So for now, I'll just say it's a fact. It's kind of like, hey, this kind of thing happens over centuries. And then the fourth sentence, in 2001, it was introduced in southeastern North America. And then within a year, boom, the trees get eaten. So this is kind of like something that happened. And I'll just say something that happened. And what I'm going to think about here is the function of the third sentence. And I'm going to say it's the general thing that we're learning. And then the final sentence is a very specific example of that general thing. Notice it's helpful when getting the function to kind of like identify the function of the surrounding sentences. That's kind of our theme for function questions. So if we think about that, that's choice B. The third sentence is a generalization, and then it's shown, it's proven or exemplified by the example that happened in 2001. So there we go. Choice B's and boy. All right. Let's see what's going on here. We got texts. And what I noticed with the question, how would Focarelli and Panetta respond to fans' findings? So what I almost always notice about these kinds of things is that we just need the main point of each group. So when we read these texts, we're going to be like, okay, what's the deal with Focarelli and Panetta? Their just basic main idea. That's what their response is going to be to the fan findings. And again, what do we need from fan? We just need her findings, the basic gist. Okay, so let's look at text one first. When companies in the same industry propose merging, they often claim that the merger will benefit consumers by increasing efficiency and lowering prices. But Ying Fan investigated this notion in the newspaper market, and she modeled a hypothetical merger and found that subscription prices would rise following a merger. Well, that's kind of sneaky. So she thinks it's going to rise. What do Dario and Fabio think? They have argued that research focuses excessively on short-term effects, which tend to be adverse. Adverse means negative. Using the case of consumer banking in Italy, they show that over the long term, the efficiency gains realized by merged companies do result in economic benefits. So not surprisingly, well, I shouldn't say that. Maybe they would agree, but basically they disagree with Fan, right? They're not straight up disagreeing, but they're saying, hey, the thing that you found was a short-term thing. You should probably realize in the long term, things usually kind of work out for consumers. In other words, it's better for consumers. So they would basically kind of contradict our findings and say, hey, long term, it works out. And if we look at choice C, yeah, it sounds like something they would say, right? Knowing these guys, they would say, hey, see if it happens in the long term, right? So we just really needed the basic sense of what each group was saying. That's what we do for this type of thing. All right, now we're getting into some literature. So what we need to focus on Eleanor. The whole passage, I guess, is about Eleanor. And this little blurb sometimes is helpful to kind of set the stage. I mean, it's short. You might as well read it. So it's from Jane Austen's novel, Sense and Sensibility. Eleanor lives with her younger sisters and her mother. And as I read this, I'm not going to read the whole thing, but I'm going to kind of highlight some parts that I think are perhaps noteworthy. She's the eldest daughter. Her advice was so effectual. She has this strength. So already super positive um description of her, right? She has this coolness of judgment, which qualified her, though only 19, to be the counselor of her mother. So we already know a lot about Eleanor. She's like really, you know, has her stuff together. I'll just say. Um, Enabled her frequently to counteract to the advantage of them all the eagerness of mind in Mrs. Dashwood, which must have generally led to imprudence. She had an excellent heart. And one thing, by the way, like when I read a sentence and I'm like, I don't really understand this sentence, not perfectly anyway, but I'm just like, I don't care. I'm just looking for the main idea here. The main idea of Eleanor is going to be in more than one sentence, probably. And we continue. She had an excellent heart. She was affectionate. She knew how to govern herself. So, yeah, this is a real easy question for me, at least. Maybe for you too. She's super mature, man. You know, how many 19-year-olds do you know who are like Eleanor? Probably not a whole lot, I guess. But yeah, she's mature for her age. And we see all those words that I underlined that kind of show that. Great. All right. Now we get another little short thing. This is apparently from a novel, The Marrow of Tradition. We need to learn about Mrs. Ochiltree's acquaintances. This is so short, we're going to just read it. I mean, not that we read everything, but I mean, this is so short that I can afford to not even worry about how I read it. I'm just going to read it normally. Um, she was a woman of strong individuality whose comments upon her acquaintances, present or absent, were marked by a frankness that means very blunt honesty that at times was no less than startling. This characteristic caused her to be more or less avoided. So she's so blunt that people avoid her. And she was aware of this and she liked it. She rejoiced in it. So, what's true about her acquaintances? Well, the only thing that we really know is that she's blunt, and then that makes them avoid her. So, that would probably make sense to be D, right? Somebody's blunt and you're avoiding them, it's probably because you don't like what they say. They offend you. And yeah, people like that are out there. Watch out. Okay, so now we have poetry, Shakespeare, the OG. Well, he's not the OG poet, but he's probably the most famous poet of our time. Not our time. Well, whatever. He's famous. You know who Shakespeare is, I'm guessing. The poem is addressed to a close friend as if he were physically present. Okay, good to know. And we need the main idea of the text, so we're going to read it. And poetry sometimes bothers people. I would say if you want to get better at reading poetry, read poetry, right? Like if you're not good at reading poetry, it's because you probably haven't ever read much. And you probably haven't read much because you don't like it or you find it confusing. Dig around online, find some poems you like, read them, start there, then explore. So anyway, weary with toil, I hurried in my bed. I think that makes sense, right? He's tired, he's going to bed. The day reposed for limbs with travel tired. That might not make as much sense, but let's just keep moving because we work around things that don't make sense. We don't like stress about them. But then begins a journey in my head, so that he's thinking, I bet, to work my mind when body's work expired, so his mind is working, his body is not. For then my thoughts from afar where I abide, you might be confused there, I kind of am too a little. Begin a zealous pilgrimage to thee, that means a journey to somebody, and keep my drooping eyelids open wide. So that last part, you kind of have to realize the person who is sleeping is thinking about the friend. And guess what? They're not sleeping. They have their eyelids open. Kind of hard to do when you sleep. So if we think about the choices, they're trying to trick us here a little bit, but D is correct, right? Person's thinking about the friend instead of falling asleep. They are not asleep yet. Their eyelids are open. They're not planning a trip. It's a figure of speech. It's figurative language. the thoughts are beginning the trip to the, not an actual planned trip. And they're not talking, it's an imaginary thing. Okay. So choice D. Great. We are about a third of the way through. If you're still watching, obviously you are. If you're if you're hearing my voice right now, thanks for sticking with it. Let's learn about a new type of question, which is support a claim. So if we're going to support a claim, we need to know what the claim is. A claim is just an argument or an opinion, and we gotta isolate it because we gotta support it. But we're probably gonna have to read the whole thing and kind of grasp, some of the details too for questions like this. So black beans are nutritionally dense, but they're hard to digest in part because of their high levels of soluble fiber and compounds like raffinose. Okay, so black beans, I wouldn't be taking notes here. If I'm taking notes, it kind of tells me I'm probably trying to get too much detail and worrying a little too much about that. So I'm just going to be like, okay, black beans hard to digest. I don't need to memorize it. They also contain anti-nutrients like tannins and trypsin inhibitors, which interfere with the body's ability to extract nutrients from foods. Okay, so hard to digest, make it hard to get nutrients. And then in their article, these people claim that using fermentation of black beans improves the digestibility of the beans and makes them more nutritious. So basically, the fermentation is counteracting these negative things that we read about earlier. So what would support that claim? The funny thing about this type of question is basically the way that we support a hypothesis is we say, hey, guess what? We tested it and it worked. And it's like, okay, yeah, I guess that would support it if it turned out to work. And if we look at the choices here, it looks like B is right. Now, we had to do a little digging here. Did it work? Did it improve the digestibility? Yeah, because there's less soluble fiber in raffinose. And if we remember, that's what made it difficult to digest, right? In the beginning, because of the fiber and the raffinose. And guess what? Even better, they displayed a reduction in the inhibitors in the tannins, which makes them more nutritious because those were anti-nutrients. So everything worked out beautifully. If this was true, I guess maybe we'll never know. But if B was right, then they are correct in their hypothesis. Okay, now when I get a table, there's a few things I have in mind. Number one, to be honest, I'm like, ugh, I don't like this type of question. I mean, there's just a lot going on, but there's some shortcuts we can take. The shortcuts are basically going to be like, first of all, an attitude. Question's always going to say data, which uses the data. Okay, so obviously we're using the table. That's why it's there. And we have the ablation rates for 3 elements in cosmic dust. I forget what ablation means, but I kind of don't care because if I don't know what it means, it's probably not that important. I just want to get the lay of the land a little bit and say, okay, what's going on here? Something about elements in cosmic dust. I just need to sort of know what the table is showing me. Again, I'm not like starting to like stress out about not knowing a word. So we got some elements, I see that, and then we have these acronyms, which I have no idea what they mean. Now, when I read the passage, especially when the passage is long and kind of confusing looking, at the end of the day, I only need to worry about the end of the passage, like this part. I'm not going to ignore the first part, but I'm definitely not going to like think about it a whole lot. I'm going to go to the end because that's where I have to like pick something that makes sense for this example from the table. But let's just kind of look, and I'm just going to glance through this. The atmosphere is bombarded with cosmic dust from all these types of things. Again, I'm not thinking too hard about what they mean. Some of the dust vaporizes is in the atmosphere in a process called ablation. Okay, apparently that means it disappears. And the faster the particles move, the higher the rate of ablation. Now, do we need to know to think about that relationship? Probably not. I'm not going to because I don't need to. In real life, maybe I'd be curious, but right now I am not curious at all. I would just want to get the question right and move on. Astrophysicist Juan led a team that calculated ablation and showed that material in slower moving, and now I'm paying attention, material in slower moving SPC or AST dust has a lower rate than the same material in faster moving HTC or OCC dust. Now, this example is inevitably going to illustrate what he showed. So what I want to show is that the slower moving one, this AST, I already know what it is. But I want to also show that the faster moving one is higher in the HTC. So what I'm looking for is I'm looking for some information about either the HTC or the OCC that's way higher than 28. And if I scan the table, oh, you know what? I realized I had to do like a little more work here because I realized that he is talking about iron and potassium. So I not only just have to look for like a HTC or OCC that's high, but I don't want to do it with sodium. I want it to be iron or potassium. So if I scan the table, I see B. I looked at B and then I was like, oh yeah, he's not talking about sodium. He is talking about iron or potassium. And there we see iron has a high one for HTC. Now you may be like, if I lost you here, like you might be like, what the heck is HTC or what's OCC? I don't understand what these things mean. Neither do I, man. I just know that we needed to show the first two things, the SPC and ACT were lower, the HGC or OCC were higher. Check. HGC higher. We're talking about iron just like he was. Check. That's all we need. So don't worry, your understanding level of the thing may vary, but it doesn't have to be that great, to get it right. I still don't know what those acronyms mean. I know I just sort of read them, but I didn't pay attention enough to care. And I would encourage you to have like a little bit of a looser attitude maybe toward worrying if you understand everything. Now, I don't want you to understand nothing, but I find that most people worry a little too much about their level. Okay, moving on to number 11. So same thing, we got economic policy uncertainty, got a bunch of years. It's not fun to read vertically, but if I turn my head, larger values is more uncertainty. Okay, thank you. I don't know why they printed that vertically. They could have done it horizontally. But anyway, we got some stuff here that we're probably going to have to refer back to, not trying to memorize it. So let's see here. The same thing applies here. I really care the most about the end, but I'm going to read the whole thing just to kind of set the stage. High levels of public uncertainty about which economic policies a country will adopt can make planning difficult, but such measures have not tended to be very detailed. That honestly didn't help me. Recently, however, economist SH analyzed trends and user reports to derive measures for blah, blah, blah. And that sentence doesn't really do anything for me either. It's just kind of like background information. I honestly can get this question right, and I'm going to have an easier time getting it right if I don't think about the first two sentences. One revelation of her work is that a general measure may not fully reflect uncertainty about specific areas of policy, as in the case of the United Kingdom, where general economic policy uncertainty, so that's the black bar. So we kind of just have to show that it's going to be different than the other bars because it's saying a general measure may not fully reflect uncertainty about specific areas. So even just glancing at the chart, I would think 2010 is a kind of a good year to be looking at because it's quite a bit different than the other bars there. And if we look at the choices here, we can see that the right answer is D because it's kind of making the case that the general one, the black bar, was lower than trade policy in 2005, but way higher than trade policy in 2010. And if you need a refresher, what did she say again? Is she's trying to say that the general measure might not really reflect uncertainty about specific areas. And that's a good example. Like it was way different than trade policy in 2025. It was way lower. And then suddenly in 2010, it's higher. So there we go, kind of not reflective. So choice D. Great, another chart. Okay, we got average number and duration of torpor. Torpor means like sluggishness, like when you're at rest. Arousal means you're active. For marmots and ground squirrels, what a cute little bunch of animals that we're going to read about here. So we see that we got the marmots, we got the ground squirrels, the torpor bouts, the duration per bout, the arousal episodes, the duration. Okay, so we can read the chart if we have to. Now you might say, well, this is an easier passage to read maybe for you than the past ones. The easier it is to read, the less danger it is to read, the less dangerous it is to read, because you're not gonna like get overwhelmed or confused if you read something easy. So I'm gonna read this because, to be honest, it's easier and more fun to read than the last passage was. When hibernating, the marmots and squirrels enter a state called torpor, which minimizes their energy. Minimizes the energy their bodies need to function. Okay, so torpor is like hibernation. Often a hibernating animal will temporarily come out of it, and its metabolic rate will rise, burning more energy. Okay, so it's just kind of defining stuff. We didn't really need to read that again, but I just did because, I don't know, felt like it. Marmots hibernate in groups and therefore burn less energy keeping warm than they would if they were alone. Really need to know that either. And again, I'm kind of struck by the only part I have to focus on much is this last sentence. So the researchers said, because the ground squirrels are alone, they have longer torpor, so longer bouts of torpor, and shorter arousal episodes than the marmots. So how can we show this? Well, that's exactly kind of what is it? What the graph is showing? Yeah, because the duration for the torpor is longer in the squirrels, and they have shorter arousal episodes too, if we just kind of look at the chart. Now, if that didn't click yet, it's probably because this is not the first time I've done the question. But if you didn't catch that yet, don't worry. The answer choices are going to help because one of them will kind of point it out. And C turns out to be right here. That's kind of what we just observed. The marmots, and we have to kind of look, and it's kind of the opposite of what we just checked. The marmots are shorter. That means the ground squirrels are longer, and their arousal episodes are longer. That means the ground squirrels were shorter, and that's what we wanted, from the passage. So a little sneaky because the answer choice said the opposite of what we were anticipating, but we can obviously, if this 16.77 days here is longer than the other one's shorter, that's exactly what C is saying. Cool. All right, another chart. We're almost done with these charts. Employment by sector in France and the US from these years. And we got a bunch of stuff going on. We got some years. We got some industries like agriculture, manufacturing, services. And then we got the same industries in the US. I'm not worrying if I understand everything here fully. Percent of total employment. Okay, so like how many people out of the total are employed in that sector. And I don't really see a pattern jumping out at me yet, but let's just see. I don't really care about the rows in the table adding up to 100 in this type of question probably. So let's see, a short passage, so I'm just going to read it pretty normally. Over the past 200 years, the percentage of the population employed in the agricultural sector has declined in France and the US, while employment in the service sector has risen. Okay. I'm not really thinking too hard yet. I'm just like, okay, agriculture declined, service rose. However, this transition happened at very different rates in the two countries. So this is what I need to illustrate. The transition happened at very different rates in the two countries. And this can be most clearly seen by comparing the employment by sector in both countries in. So I have to kind of point out on the chart where those things are happening. The agriculture declined and the employment and service rose. Happened in both countries, but at different rates. Where do I see that in the chart? Now, even before I look at the answer choices, I'm like, where do I see the biggest kind of disparity? And I'm looking at agriculture in France and services in France. And I am looking at those same columns in the US. And I can kind of see that in the US, like from 1900 to 1950, agriculture in France, it changed, but look, in the US, it changed like way more. And then services in France changed services in the US changed even more. So I can see that the US change is much bigger in both of those industries in those years. And that looks like choice A. This is kind of a pain if you just go choice by choice here because you're going to be checking 4 different things, and that's annoying. So what I would suggest to do is look and see if you notice like the biggest difference in the chart. Um, I kind of spotted that in the agriculture in the US, like that's a really big gap compared to agriculture in France. Whereas if I compared some other years, they both kind of have a similar change. Like if I compare 18 and 1900, they're both about different by, in the 20s somewhere. Whereas 1900 to 1950, France difference is, like 11 and the US difference is way bigger. So there we go. Choice A. Whew, finally done with those charts. I don't know why I just dislike the charts so much. I mean, I don't mean to impart my preferences on you guys, but I just don't like them. They take, I don't know, maybe a little more work. That's probably why. All right. What logically completes the text? This is a totally different skill. How do we logically complete something? Usually we have a situation that will make something make sense. And sometimes it'll be a situation that right now it does not make sense. So we're looking to make things make sense. Basically, that's what we mean by logically. So again, we're just like a lot of times when we read, we're looking for the main idea of things. We read this passage, we get this thing, this plant, it's become invasive in North America. It sickens cattle, it displaces. Okay, so this plant's bad. Then we learn it can be controlled with chemical herbicides, but that has a downside, kills the harmless, innocent little plants. Okay, now if we're going to complete this text, it's not like the situation is illogical, but we're going to kind of make it make sense. And how are we going to do that? We need to read the third sentence. Recent research on introducing DNA into plant species to inhibit their reproduction may offer a path toward exclusively targeting the bad plant. Consequently, so as a result, it sounds like this is going to be like a solution to our problem. It's going to kill the bad plant and it's not going to hurt the good plant. And if we think about the choices here, D is saying just that. It's reducing the bad plant without harming. So no, it's kind of like we have a dilemma and we're fixing the dilemma. Like that's one way we can look at this sort of question. We have a solution that kills things. Oh, hey, now we have a new solution. If it's going to be like logically going to introduce a path toward targeting it, the logic will be it targets it without hurting the other plants. All right, now we're in grammar land. So anytime we see standard English, that means grammar, punctuation, usage. So let's see. These 2 young people were frustrated by lack of diverse characters. They joined forces to found Cake Literary Book Packaging company that specializes. B is right here. If we just put the word company, it would be like bad English, just kind of nonsensical. I think there's not like a rule I can tell you, but if you read the sentence without the word that here, then it's just bad grammar. Then the verb specializes would be in the wrong form. So we needed that. Do we need a comma? No, we don't need a comma. We kind of need a reason to put a comma. And I'm not going to teach like all the comma rules that there are to teach right now, but this is a situation where there's no rule to indicate that we need a comma, so we're not going to use one. We don't get to just put commas because we feel like it. There's got to be a reason. And by reason, I mean rule. So in this case, we don't have a rule that tells us there, so it's going to be without a comma. Choice B. All right. Another one. 1930, Japanese American artist depicted the beauty of Yosemite in 2 memorable woodcuts, Evening Carroll Inn, Lake Basin, and the High Sierra. 2019, exhibited along. So it seems like if you can fill in your own word as a guess, like my brain naturally was like they were exhibited because the works are the they, like his or her works. So it's choice B, they, aka his or her works, were exhibited. And it's of course were because it's plural. They were, we wouldn't say they was, obviously. And it's they because it's more than one work. Those are two different works, both of them. So it's not going to be this. It's not going to be some because there's two of them. Some of them would be both. We can't just use some to indicate all of them. That would imply there's not all of them. All right, enough commentary. Let's move on. American writer, Edie, who emigrated from Haiti, won acclaim for her powerful short stories, novels, and essays. And I'm unsure what to pick here until I read the rest of it. Praising her lyrical yet unflinching depictions of her native country's turbulent history, writer Robert. Aha. So we need it to be D. We need it to be D because that works as two complete sentences. If you can make two complete sentences and they're both sentences, that's probably right. The first sentence is everything up until the word essays. She won acclaim for her short stories, novels, and essays, period. And then praising her lyrical stuff, Robert has compared her to whatever. That's a complete sentence too. So we're good to go. We need to join two complete sentences with either a period, a semicolon, maybe we would use a dash, maybe a colon, maybe a comma and a conjunction. But anyway, the only option we have to do so here is D, period. These are all kind of fun facts to learn sometimes. Like I like this one. In 1966, Emmett Ashford became the first African-American to umpire a baseball game. His energetic gestures, announcing when a player had struck out, and his habit of barreling after a hit ball to see if it would land out of bounds. And I'm peeking at the answer choices to see like what I'm talking about here. Helped transform. And let's just break this one down a little bit because I think we probably should. We need the word bounds there, out of bounds. Okay, that means out of the playing field area. That's fair territory. Or, and then what is the word helped about? His gestures helped. So we can kind of break it down to that. His gestures helped. So it's easier to kind of hear that agreement, that subject-verb agreement. Everything after the word gestures, this is all just kind of like information about the gestures. Like everything, all of this stuff that I'm bracketing, it's just information kind of like about his gestures. But ultimately, we need to wait until we get to the verb that's talking about the gestures, and the verb is the verb helped, which is just past tense. His gestures helped. And it's easier to hear it or kind of recognize it if you just take out the stuff in the middle. I don't know why I put this bracket after the word transform. Ignore that one. It should have been after here, right there. So all this stuff. But anyway, if you can say to yourself, okay, I'm going to sort of just think about like what helped, and then go look for the word. Usually it's going to be way early in the sentence. A lot of times right at the beginning, the thing that did the thing. In other words, the thing that helped is the gestures. And everything in between, the subject and the verb here are just like additional description about like what the gestures were like. But we didn't really get the verb yet until it helped. Okay, so let's see here. Number 19. In crafting her fantasy fiction, Nigerian-born British author Helen has drawn inspiration from the classic 19th century fairy tales of the Brothers Grimm. Her 2014 novel, Boy Snow Bird, is a complex telling of the story of Snow White, while her 2019 novel, Gingerbread, offers a delicious twist. Doesn't that make you kind of hungry for gingerbread? It does for me. So number 19 is C. Another case where we don't really have a rule that indicates we need a punctuation mark. Therefore, we don't use one. And another way we could put this is some punctuation marks here are wrong. For instance, the colon would always be wrong here because everything in the sentence before the colon up until the colon, it would have to be a standalone sentence. In other words, if we read the sentence, blah, 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 and stopped at the word gingerbread, we cannot put a period there. Therefore, we cannot put a colon there. So that's just going to be wrong. No need for a comma here. And nothing really indicating we have a need for a dash here either. So it's just going to be choice C. All right, number 20. More grammar stuff. The violins made in the 17th century by Antonio Stradivari have been celebrated as some of the finest in the world. Close collaboration with musicians, Stradivari introduced changes to the shape of a traditional violin, flattening some of the instrument's curves and making it lighter overall. Yeah, because we're talking about the violin. So it's an it, it's not plural, singular. Yeah, pretty straightforward, I guess, if you just think about like which pronoun do I need and to tell what you need, what are you referring to? Oh yeah, we're talking about the violin. That's an it. All right, so let's see here. During the English neoclassical period, many writers imitated the epic poetry and satires of ancient Greece and Rome. They were not the first in England to adopt the literary modes of classical antiquity, however, some of the most prominent figures. And what I'm doing here, this turns out to be choice C. And I had a feeling it would be, because this is kind of a common trick with however. Like a lot of times in writing, we kind of put a however with commas on either side of it. The thing about that is, though, if you have a however and there's a semicolon, we need the semicolon here because everything after the word however is a standalone sentence. So if you had put a comma there, a comma cannot separate off, a comma can't be between two complete sentences. That's what we call comma splice. That's always wrong. So here, let me just show you the complete sentences. The first complete sentence is everything up until the word however. In other words, they were not the first in England to adopt the literary modes of classical antiquity, however. I could stop there and I could put a period. I could also start at the word some and read everything else, and that's a sentence too. Some of the most prominent figures of the early Renaissance period were also influenced by ancient Greek and Roman literature. Since those are both complete sentences, I need to separate two complete sentences with either a semicolon, period, maybe a dash, a comma, and a coordinating conjunction. But here, the only option I have is a semicolon. The options with the commas are going to be wrong, and I need something to separate them. I can't just do nothing, so A would be wrong, but the commas would definitely be wrong. Those are comma splices. We cannot separate two complete sentences with just a comma unless we have a coordinating conjunction, and we don't. Coordinating conjunctions are like the word and or but, things like that. All right, logical transition. So this is where we kind of say we need to connect them. An easy way to think about connections is we're going to either support each other or we're going to fight each other in contrast. So let's see what we have here between the two sentences. One poll suggested that Kennedy lost badly because only 21% of them, people on the radio, thought he was the winner. And then the next sentence is kind of saying, well, actually, it was considered a victory for Kennedy, who rated higher than his opponent on TV. So we have a very clear contrast. If we look at the choices, there's only one option to create a contrast, which is nevertheless. So we need to pick a word that logically joins the sentences. Since the meanings of the sentences are like in opposition, they're contrasting, we need a word that creates that. We only have one choice, nevertheless. All right, let's see. Logical transition again. So we're going to look for that same pattern between the sentences here, or between, it's not always just two sentences, but we could kind of say, hey, the pattern between the parts of the passage. All right, in that year, she was living in Paris. She was studying the style and beginning to make a name for herself as a painter. So far, so good, just information about her. And then we learned that she longed to return to her childhood home of India. Only there, she believed, could her art truly flourish. So we have another very clear contrast here, because she's living in Paris, making a name for herself, but then she really wants to go back to India. So the only word that creates a contrast here is still. Still, she wanted to go back to India. Okay. Contrast again, kind of like the last example. Right. In 1925, Carl challenged prevailing views about how landscapes influence human cultures. So we're starting off by learning he is challenging views. And then the next sentence is saying kind of like an example of that. He argued that instead of being shaped by natural surroundings, cultures play an active role in their own development. So we have a support relationship here. And I would further characterize the second sentence as not, it's supporting it by continuing to talk about it. It's kind of giving an example. So specifically here is a really good choice because it's like a specific example of like the general thing he was doing. So recognizing that the author is still talking about the thing, just getting more specific. This is a super common thing for authors to do in a reading passage. Hey, we're still talking about it, but now here's an example. So specifically, that indicates we have an example. Although those who migrated to California in 1849 dreamed of finding gold nuggets in stream beds, the state's richest deposits were buried deeply in rock beyond the reach of individual prospectors. And then the next sentence, many people gave up on their dreams and went to work for a big company capable of mining. So again, we kind of have a logical support relationship here because by the end of the first sentence and where we end up counts more, where we end up at the end of the first sentence is like we can't get to them because they're buried in the rock. And then the next sentence is continuing to talk about that. And it's kind of like a support relationship in this case, kind of a cause and effect. So consequently, so that makes sense, right? Like, hey, it's buried in the rock. We can't do anything about it. Crap, we're going to have to join the big company. And that's what they did. So consequently, it's like a cause and effect support. So the final two questions here are note taking. I usually find for note taking, the most important thing to do is to focus on what the question wants. So we need to present the study and its conclusions. And there's going to be some note stuff that are just kind of like subject matter. Like, what are we studying? We're studying cat bone fragments in this rural or ruins of this village. They were old. They showed that the cats ate grain, and that's evidence they may have been domesticated. And we want to, it's basically kind of a summary skill. We just don't need to summarize everything. And at the end of the day, when you pick a choice, just look back at the question to make sure you actually fulfilled what it's asking. So we have to just say, okay, here's the study. We studied the bones to find they ate grain, and the conclusion that they were domesticated. All right. That's choice B, right? That's very similar to what we said. The study of the bones found that they were domesticated. So we're just being tested on our ability to summarize, the important parts, the study and the conclusions. So again, when we're reading stuff, we're not really worrying if we get it all the first time. We can always look back. All right, final question. We're almost done. Let's see. We want to emphasize a difference in the origins of the two words. And this one, I'm just going to show you that we can get this right. Honestly, you could get this right probably two. That without actually reading the passage. And let's just think about, do we want to do this when we're taking the test? Maybe not, but you could, because it's only A is kind of showing that they have different origins. That's what the question wanted, right? Emphasizing a difference in the origins. Guardon is from Anglo-French. Laodicean is from ancient Greek. B doesn't talk about the origins at all. C doesn't talk about the origins at all. D kind of does talk about the origins, but it doesn't say that they're different origins. So honestly, pretty easy to get right just by like looking at the choices. But if we had read it, let's just see. Hey, it's a spelling bee, diverse origins. She or he spelled that word right. That's its origin. Kavya spelled a different word right. It's from that origin. So a bunch of stuff going on here, but honestly, we just had to pick a choice that showed that the words had different origins. We didn't really need to know much else. So it's about like picking through the notes to find the relevant detail. All right, so this concludes module 1. I'll be back soon with both module twos, the normal version and the hard version. So stay tuned for that. Good luck with the rest of your SAT prep.